I thought I was just stopping by a friend's house, but when his mother opened the door and said, "You're old enough to knock, but not old enough to leave," I realized my life was about to change. Didn't think much of it when I walked up to my friend's house that evening. It was supposed to be simple, drop by, hang out for an hour, maybe grab food together like we always did. I had no plans of stepping into something that would stay with me for years. The porch light was already on, even though the sun hadn't completely disappeared yet. That faint in-between hour where everything feels soft, when shadows stretch across the street and the air cools but hasn't gone cold. I could hear the hum of crickets starting in the distance. I raised my hand and knocked. It was a casual knock, nothing special. I expected my friend's heavy footsteps pounding down the hall, or maybe his voice yelling, "Come in," like he usually did. Instead, there was silence. A pause. Then, the sound of lighter footsteps. Slower. More deliberate. The door opened, and it wasn't my friend standing there. It was his mother. She looked almost exactly as I remembered, and yet, different. Time has a way of softening certain things and sharpening others. She was in her early 40s now, though she carried herself with the quiet elegance of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. Her dark hair, pulled loosely back, framed her face in a way that made the light behind her seem softer. She wore a simple cardigan over a blouse, nothing extraordinary, but on her it looked complete. Effortless. Her eyes landed on me, surprised at first, and then something else, something unreadable. And then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that tugged just enough at the corner of her lips. "You're old enough to knock," she said softly, almost like she was teasing me, "but not old enough to leave." I froze for half a second, the words catching me off guard. It wasn't just what she said. It was the way she said it. The warmth in her voice wasn't quite maternal, wasn't quite casual either. It lingered in that gray space of playful, but edged with something I couldn't name yet. I laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of my neck. Is he home?" Her head tilted slightly, and she shook it. "No. He's out." "Didn't tell you?" I felt my cheeks warm, embarrassed that I'd shown up unannounced. "Guess he forgot." She leaned her shoulder against the doorway, folding her arms loosely across her chest. The posture was relaxed, but there was something disarming about the way her eyes held mine. They didn't dart away. They didn't treat me like a kid standing on her doorstep. For a moment, the quiet between us stretched. And I noticed everything, the faint scent of coffee that drifted from inside, the glow of the lamp spilling across the hallway behind her, the sound of her bracelet sliding gently against her wrist when she shifted. Small, ordinary details, but suddenly magnified. "You're already here," she said finally, her tone lighter this time. "Might as well come in. No point in leaving before the evening's even started." I hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to recognize the hesitation wasn't about politeness, it was about her. About stepping into a space that suddenly felt different than it used to. Still, I nodded. "Yeah. I guess you're right." She stepped back, opening the door wider. The gesture was simple, but the way her eyes lingered on me as I crossed the threshold made the air feel charged. I walked into the house, the familiar scent of wood and fabric softener wrapping around me. Yet it didn't feel like it had when I was younger, when this house was just a place to crash, play games, or eat snacks in the kitchen. Now, it felt quieter. Warmer. More intimate. Behind me, I heard the door close with a soft click. And in that moment, though I couldn't explain why, I knew this wasn't going to be just another casual evening. It started with a knock. And her voice, reminding me with a strange kind of certainty, "You're old enough to knock, but not old enough to leave." The living room felt different than I remembered. Not just cleaner or tidier, but quieter, like it carried its own stillness. A soft lamp glowed from the corner, casting warm gold over the books stacked on the coffee table and the framed photographs along the wall. I followed her inside slowly, almost too aware of my own footsteps against the wooden floor. She moved with the kind of ease that made it obvious this was her space, her sanctuary. And yet, the way she glanced back at me, as if measuring the distance I kept from her, made it feel like I wasn't just stepping into a house. I was stepping into her world. "You can sit," she said gently, nodding toward the sofa. I lowered myself into the cushions, suddenly noticing the faint scent of her perfume in the fabric. Not overpowering, just a trace, like it had been left behind without her meaning to. "Something to drink?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen archway. "Oh, water's fine," I said quickly. But she waved a hand, dismissing the suggestion. "Water's too plain. You need something warmer." A moment later, I heard the clink of cups, the quiet whistle of a kettle. I sat there, taking everything in, the muted hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the way the lamplight curved across the glass cabinet where a row of wine bottles stood. When she returned, she wasn't carrying water. She placed a small tray on the table, with 2 cups of steaming tea. The scent, spiced, earthy, comforting, rose immediately. "You don't mind tea, do you?" she asked, settling down beside me. I shook my head. "Not at all." She handed me a cup. For a moment, our fingers brushed as I took it, and I felt the heat of her skin even more than the heat of the porcelain. It wasn't an accident, not exactly. But it wasn't deliberate either. Just one of those moments that feels ordinary, until your heart makes it something else. I lifted the cup slowly. The warmth bled into my palms, grounding me. She leaned back into the sofa, her posture casual, though her eyes flicked toward me with quiet attention. "So, how's school? Or is it work now?" "A bit of both," I said, my voice a touch unsteady. "Classes during the day, shifts at night. Keeps me moving." Her lips curved faintly, almost like approval. "Ambitious. You remind me of your father at that age. Or maybe, of myself." Her words lingered. She didn't elaborate, but in the pause that followed, I caught something, an echo of weariness, of time passing too quickly. "What about you?" I asked before I could stop myself. "What have you been up to?" The question surprised her, I could tell. People don't usually ask parents about them. They ask about their children, their routines, their roles. But she seemed to soften. "Oh, you know," she said lightly, but her tone didn't quite match. "Work. Keeping the house running. Reading when I can. The usual." The usual. And yet, the way she looked into her cup, as if avoiding something deeper, made me feel like her usual carried more weight than she let on. I nodded, but didn't press. Instead, I let the silence stretch a little. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. The kind of silence that doesn't push you away, but draws you closer. Her laugh broke it. A low, genuine sound, when she caught me glancing at the framed photo of her younger self with her son. "Don't tell me you're comparing the years," she teased softly. I shook my head quickly, flustered. "No, I was just. I mean, you look the same. Almost." That made her smile, slow, deliberate, and a little sad at the edges. "Almost," she repeated, like she was tasting the word. The conversation moved again, lighter now. Music she used to listen to. A book I'd been reading. The way the neighborhood had changed since I was younger. But underneath the easy words was something neither of us acknowledged, this awareness that we were sitting close on the sofa, the space between us narrower than it had any right to be. I noticed the faint brush of her knee against mine when she shifted. Not hard enough to be intentional. Not soft enough to ignore. My chest tightened, but I stayed still. The tea cooled in my hands, untouched. I realized then that this wasn't about tea, or conversation, or filling the silence of an empty house. This was about the fact that I had knocked, and she had answered. That the absence of her son had created a space between us that neither of us had expected, but both of us felt. And though the evening was just beginning, I already knew it was leading somewhere I couldn't name. The tea had gone lukewarm, but neither of us seemed to notice. What mattered wasn't the drink, or even the words we exchanged, it was the rhythm between them. The pauses. The way her eyes lingered longer than necessary. The way I found myself leaning forward, not because I couldn't hear, but because I wanted to be closer. She asked me about my studies, and for once I didn't give the usual polite answer. I told her how restless I felt, how I wanted something more than just going through motions, chasing grades, clocking in and out of part-time jobs. She listened. Really listened. Not with distracted nods or half-formed replies, but with the kind of attention that felt rare. Her chin rested lightly on her hand, her gaze steady, as though every word I said carried weight. When I finished, there was a pause. A silence that didn't feel empty. She drew a quiet breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "You know," she said softly, "when I was your age, I thought I had everything figured out. I was so sure I knew the shape of my future. And then life had other plans." Her tone wasn't bitter, but there was a shadow in it. A memory tucked behind her eyes. I hesitated, then asked, "Do you regret it?" Her gaze flicked to me, startled, not by the question itself, but by the fact that I dared to ask. She didn't answer right away. She set her cup down, her fingers brushing lightly against the porcelain, before folding her hands in her lap. "Some days," she admitted, her voice low. "Other days, I think, maybe everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. Even the things that hurt." Her honesty hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the kind of answer you give lightly. It wasn't the kind of answer you give to just anyone. And suddenly, I noticed things I hadn't before. The faint lines at the corner of her eyes, not flaws, but traces of laughter and years. The way her voice shifted when she spoke of the past, carrying both strength and weariness. The grace in her restraint. "You sound like you've lived a lot," I murmured without thinking. That made her smile, small and almost amused. "I suppose I have. More than you. Less than I will." Our eyes met then, and for a heartbeat, the air thickened. I didn't look away. Neither did she. And in that silence, something unspoken hung between us, a recognition, fragile and dangerous. Her knee brushed mine again, this time not by accident. Or maybe it was. But I felt the warmth of it all the same, running through me like a spark. I should have pulled back. I should have shifted away. Instead, I stayed perfectly still. She noticed. I could tell by the faint catch of her breath, the way her fingers curled slightly against her lap. For a moment, I thought she might say something, draw a line, remind me of who I was, who she was. But she didn't. Instead, she changed the subject, her voice a little too steady. You always were a curious kid. Asking questions others wouldn't. I'm not a kid anymore, I said before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air, heavier than I intended. Her eyes flicked to mine again. There was no judgment in them, no anger. Just quiet, measured surprise. And then, something else. Something she didn't name, and I didn't dare assume. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to respond. But she closed them again, pressing her hand lightly against her cup instead, as though grounding herself. The silence between us grew, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was alive, charged with things we weren't ready to admit. I shifted slightly, my hand brushing against the sofa cushion closer to hers. Not touching, just near enough to feel the possibility. She noticed. I know she did. But she said nothing. That was the line. Not spoken aloud, but understood. We were towing it, circling it, pretending it wasn't there while both of us felt it more with each passing second. And as the clock ticked softly on the wall, I realized I wasn't just sitting in a living room anymore. I was balanced on the edge of something vast, something I couldn't name yet, but that had already begun. The air had grown thicker. Not heavy in a way that pressed down, but charged, like the stillness before a summer storm. Every small sound seemed amplified, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the wall clock, even the soft rustle of fabric when either of us shifted slightly on the sofa. I tried to focus on the cup of tea in my hand, but my grip betrayed me. My fingers trembled just enough for the porcelain to rattle softly against the saucer. It wasn't nerves exactly, not in the way I felt before an exam or a job interview. It was something sharper, more alive. She noticed. Of course she did. Her eyes dropped to my hand, lingering there for a heartbeat, before lifting back to my face. I felt heat rise into my cheeks, the kind you can't hide, no matter how steady you try to appear. Without a word, she reached forward and placed her hand over mine. It was such a simple gesture. No sudden movement, no hesitation, just the quiet weight of her touch settling gently over my unsteady fingers. And yet, in that moment, everything inside me shifted. Her hand was warm, softer than I'd expected, though her palm carried a strength that spoke of years spent holding together more than just cups and saucers. The pressure wasn't firm, but it was steady, anchoring me, as though she were saying, "Slow down. Breathe. You're here." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just looked at her, at the way her lashes lowered slightly, at the way her breath caught and released as though she, too, was aware this was more than a casual kindness. Seconds stretched, long and unbroken. I thought about how easy it would be to curl my fingers upward, to let them lace through hers. The thought alone made my pulse quicken, but I stayed still. This wasn't a moment to rush. This was a moment to hold. Her thumb brushed lightly against the back of my hand. Not enough to be deliberate, not enough to be careless. Just enough to blur the line between comfort and something unspoken. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. You don't have to, I started, my voice quieter than I intended. Her eyes lifted to mine, steady, unwavering. I know, she said softly. And that was all. 3 words, simple and unadorned, but they carried the weight of everything she wasn't saying. She knew. She felt. And she wasn't pulling away. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with the ache of wanting something I didn't dare reach for. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she withdrew her hand. Slowly, carefully, as though the act itself required effort. Her fingers slid from mine, leaving behind an absence I felt immediately, like the echo of warmth still clinging to my skin. She leaned back slightly, her eyes flicking toward the clock on the wall, though it was clear she wasn't really looking at it. Her composure returned, graceful and measured, but something had cracked in the silence between us, something we couldn't patch up with small talk anymore. I set my cup down on the table, afraid I'd drop it if I tried to hold it any longer. My hands felt empty without hers. She shifted, folding her arms loosely, almost protectively. This is dangerous, she murmured, half to herself, half to me. I could have agreed. I could have eased the tension, changed the subject, laughed it off. But instead, I said nothing. I just let the silence answer for me. Her gaze returned to mine, softer now, searching. For what, I wasn't sure. Permission? Reassurance? Or maybe the same question I carried, what are we doing? Neither of us had an answer. And yet, when her shoulder brushed mine as she adjusted against the sofa, neither of us moved away. The storm outside never came. No thunder, no lightning. Just the quiet pulse of something gathering strength in the air, between her and me. And though nothing had truly happened, not yet, something in me knew that line we'd been circling for so long, we had just crossed it. She was the one to move first. One moment, her shoulder was brushing mine, our hands almost close enough to touch again. The next, she was standing, abruptly, almost too quickly, as though she needed distance just to breathe. This isn't right, she said, her voice firmer than before. I looked up at her, startled. The lamplight traced the edges of her profile, her hair falling forward, the tension in her jaw, the way her hand hovered near her temple like she was holding back more than words. You're my son's friend, she added, and though the words were steady, her eyes betrayed her. They weren't cold. They weren't even stern. They were afraid. Afraid of herself, of me, of whatever invisible line we had been towing for too long. I stood slowly, careful not to close the gap between us too quickly. I know, I admitted. My voice cracked a little, but I didn't care. I know what this looks like. But I've never felt more understood than I do when I'm here. With you. Her breath caught. Just enough for me to notice. She shook her head, almost sharply, pacing toward the window. The blinds were half closed, letting in faint traces of streetlight that cut across her figure in pale stripes. She pressed her palm against the frame, her back to me, as if she needed the solidness of the wall to steady herself. You don't understand, she whispered, but the break in her voice betrayed her. It's not that simple. I took a step closer, then stopped. Maybe it isn't. But you don't have to pretend like you don't feel it too. Silence. Her shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. She turned slowly, her eyes finding mine. And there it was, the truth neither of us had dared to name, shimmering in the space between us. Her composure faltered then. She let out a quiet laugh, but it wasn't from amusement. It was soft, brittle, like glass threatening to crack. "Do you have any idea how long it's been since I've let anyone this close?" she asked. I shook my head, my chest tight. "No. But I can see it. I can see how much you've been holding back." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she sank back into the armchair across from the sofa, her movements heavy. She pressed her fingers to her temple, her other hand gripping the armrest like she needed something to hold on to. "I told myself I'd never," she started, then stopped, her voice trailing off. She exhaled slowly, eyes closing for a moment. "Not with someone younger. Not with someone who shouldn't even be thinking of me this way." Her honesty cut through me. Not because it was rejection, but because it was proof. Proof she had thought of me in that way. I moved toward the sofa again, lowering myself onto the edge, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. My voice came out quieter this time, more careful. "You think I haven't questioned this?" "I have. 100 times. But no matter how much I try to reason it away, I still want to be here. With you." Her eyes opened then, locking onto mine. They were shimmering now, not with tears exactly, but with something raw, unshielded. The air stretched thin. She didn't move. Neither did I. Finally, she whispered, "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" I asked gently. "Because I believe you," she admitted. The words landed like a confession, heavier than any touch, heavier than any kiss could have been. I let the silence hold. I didn't push. I didn't demand. I just let her see the truth in my eyes, unguarded, without apology. The room felt both too large and too small. Too large, because of the space she insisted on keeping between us. Too small, because even with that space, I could feel her everywhere, the scent of her perfume, the warmth of her touch still lingering in my hand, the echo of her voice saying what she wasn't supposed to admit. Neither of us moved closer. Neither of us walked away. We were caught in the middle, between fear and desire, between what was right and what felt inevitable. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about crossing a line. This was about deciding if either of us was brave enough to admit what we already knew. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it pulsed, alive with everything unsaid. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my hands clasped together, while she sat across from me in the armchair, her posture guarded, her gaze lowered. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly sweeping across the blinds before fading into the distance. And then it was just us again, caught in this fragile standoff. Finally, she shifted. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she rose from the chair and crossed the room. Each step was careful, deliberate, as though she were walking a line drawn in sand. She didn't sit back on the sofa where I was, she sat on the armrest instead, close but angled, her body half turned toward me. Her voice, when it came, was softer than before. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, her eyes flicking to mine for only a second before darting away. "But I don't want it to vanish. Not yet." The words landed gently, but they reverberated inside me like a bell. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Then don't let it. Her lips parted, as though she wanted to argue. Instead, she let out a quiet breath that carried both relief and fear. She lowered herself slowly onto the sofa beside me, not too close, not too far. The cushion dipped with her weight, and suddenly, the space between us felt both unbearably small and impossibly wide. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together. I watched the faint tremor in them, subtle but real. Without thinking, I moved mine closer, inch by inch, until the back of my hand brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she released her own clasp and let her palm rest lightly over mine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. But the way her hand settled there carried more meaning than words ever could. Her touch was tentative at first, testing, as though she was afraid of what it might mean. Then, slowly, she let her fingers curl slightly, enough to acknowledge what was happening, what had been happening all evening. Her hair slipped forward over her shoulder as she exhaled, brushing lightly against my arm. The faint tickle of it made me acutely aware of how close she was now, how every breath she took seemed to pull me further into her gravity. For a moment, she didn't speak. And then, in the quietest whisper, she said, "You're too young to know what this could cost." I turned to her, our faces closer now than they'd ever been. Maybe. But I'm old enough to know what I feel. Her eyes lifted then, meeting mine fully. They were searching, conflicted, yet softened by something undeniable. Vulnerability. She held my gaze for a long moment, and I could feel the question in her silence. "Are you sure? Are you ready?" I answered without words. I let my thumb brush gently across the side of her hand, a small, steady gesture that said yes. Her breath caught again, but this time she didn't look away. The house around us seemed to fade, the ticking clock, the muted hum of the fridge, even the faint noises of the neighborhood outside. All that remained was the fragile warmth of her hand in mine, the steady thrum of my heartbeat, and the way her eyes softened as though she, too, had stopped fighting. She leaned the slightest bit closer, just enough for her shoulder to graze mine. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke again. "If we're going to stay in this moment, it has to be for the right reasons." I nodded, my voice low, certain. "Then let's find them together." Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but something close. The kind of expression that carried both surrender and hesitation. For the first time all evening, her posture eased. She rested lightly against me, just enough for the weight of her presence to settle across my chest like a promise neither of us dared put into words. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was fragile, tender, a silence that asked for patience instead of answers. And for the first time, I believed she wasn't going to push me away. Not tonight. The room was still. Not silent in a hollow way, but still in that fragile, golden sense, like everything had found its rightful place. She was leaning gently against me now, her head just near my shoulder, our hands still lightly joined. I was afraid to move, afraid to disturb the peace that had settled between us. I realized in that moment that the choice had already been made. Not with grand declarations, not with sudden passion, but with small, deliberate gestures, her hand on mine, her shoulder brushing close, the way she had stopped pulling away. She exhaled slowly, her breath warming the space between us. "You don't understand the weight of this," she said softly, though her words lacked the firmness they once carried. "People will talk. Your friend, my son, her voice caught, but she didn't withdraw. I tightened my fingers around hers, steady, reassuring. I don't care what they say. What I feel when I'm here with you, it matters more than any of that. For the first time that night, her eyes softened fully, unshielded. The defenses she had carried so tightly began to melt, and what remained was something vulnerable, something real. She turned her face slightly toward me, close enough that I could see the faint lines by her eyes, the way the lamplight deepened the warmth of her skin. She wasn't flawless, wasn't untouched by time, and that was exactly what made her beautiful. I don't want to be foolish, she whispered. You're not, I said, my voice low but certain. You're brave. Her lips curved faintly, and for a heartbeat I thought she might laugh, but instead she leaned closer, resting her forehead gently against mine. The contact was feather light, yet it carried all the weight of the weeks, months, maybe years of feelings we had both been circling around. Neither of us rushed. We simply stayed like that, two people caught between caution and longing, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. And then, almost shyly, she turned her face just enough for her cheek to brush against mine. It wasn't a kiss, not fully. It was softer than that, safer, like the promise of something waiting if we were brave enough to reach for it. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of her skin linger against mine. The world outside didn't exist anymore. It was only her presence, her quiet trembling, her courage in allowing this moment to happen at all. When she finally drew back, her eyes were glistening. Not with regret, but with a kind of clarity. This can't be casual, she said, her voice steady now, almost firm again. If we move forward, it has to mean something. It has to be real. I nodded, my chest tightening with the weight of her words. It already is. For a long time, she searched my face. And then, as though something inside her had finally given permission, she let her hand rise from mine and rest softly against my cheek. Her thumb traced once along my jaw, delicate, uncertain, but undeniably tender. I leaned into her touch, not needing to say anything else. Everything that mattered was already here, in the quiet exchange of hands and glances, in the trust she had finally allowed to bloom. She drew in a breath, steadying herself. And then she said the words that would stay with me forever, then we'll find out together what this really is. In that instant, the tension that had wound so tightly between us seemed to ease, not gone, but transformed. What had been fear became possibility. What had been hesitation became fragile hope. We sat there, not rushing, not trying to define more than we were ready for. Her head found its place against my shoulder at last, her body softening into mine. I held her hand, no longer tentative, but sure. The clock ticked on. The night deepened. But for us, time didn't matter. We had chosen. And whatever came next, judgment, questions, uncertainty, we would face it side by side.